So we're at Sissinghurst, and that's the towers of Sissinghurst, the garden of Vidal Sackville West. Vita was born at Knowle, another huge old rambling mansion. She did not inherit Knowle, it went to her uncle, although she wanted to stay there. She married in 1913, and today we would say that they were both LGBTQ. They both had numerous affairs. Sissinghurst was donated to the National Trust in 1962 when Vita died, but it took another 5 years for Nigel, Vita's son, to convince the National Trust to take the property. The National Trust felt that it wasn't much of a garden. Now it's number 42 on the National Trust's most visited list, and in 2021-22, it had about 150,000 visitors. Now, admission is £13 per adult, plus there's a parking fee, and they also run a cafe and a gift shop there on the premise, so I think the place is making money for them. Being a National Trust property, it was very well run, lots of paid help and volunteers. We were lucky that the site provided us with a guide. He was very knowledgeable and told us a lot about the gardens and history of the estate and the family. I'll shut up and let him tell you some of the story.
It just became dilapidated and the ravages of time.
It's an Elizabethan deer park.
All that was happening was that no one was interested in the buildings, all just farmland. But in 1930, Vita and Harold, who had been married for 16 years at that time, they'd been living in a place just outside Sevenoaks, a place called Long Barn. And they left Long Barn because the next door farmer was expanding the chicken breeding business, and they wanted to get away from that. We'll keep walking down a bit. So she started looking, and through personal contacts and friends, she heard about this place that was available. So she came to see it, and she immediately fell in love with it. Vita was a writer, a very successful novelist and poet, a romantic poet. So she was very romantic at heart. As soon as she saw this place, it struck a chord with her. Particularly the tower. When she saw the tower, she had this vision of sitting in the tower, writing poetry, and that's ultimately exactly what she did. So she fell in love with it, despite the fact the building was a complete wreck. But she wanted to live here, so she bought it. In 1930, for 500 acres of farmland and all the buildings you can see, she paid the princely sum of £12,000. She then had to spend another £15,000 in fixing it up. It's a big fixer-upper. They owned it for 2 years before they could move in because there was literally nothing here. But when they did move in, 1932, they then lived here extremely happily for the remainder of their lives. Vita was here until 1962 when she passed, and her husband Harold was here another 6 years after that. But life here was very, very happy. Basically, as I say, the building is an Elizabethan manor house. Originally, there were two wings which are long gone out the back of it, so it was like a great big joined up square. And so consequently, it looks like a series of separate buildings. It wasn't originally. They were all part of the same complex at one time. Anyway, Vita and Harold moved in. Before they even moved in, they started work on the garden. And I have to say, neither Vita or Harold were trained in gardening. No formal training at all. They just learned by trying things, making mistakes, and moving on, and hopefully getting it right the next time. But having said that, no formal training. Towards the end of her life, she was awarded the highest medal of honour by the Royal Horticultural Society for her achievements. But again, as I say, she wouldn't have said gardening was her thing. It was her hobby. It was her, a distraction from writing.
The Sackville West on the left and the Baker on the right. The Bakers were the original owners in the 1500s.
It was all built at the same time, but because it's Elizabethan, I guess, nothing actually lines up. There are no straight lines. Look here, look at this, where these paving stones join up. Why aren't they square? You see, the tower should be square to the front building. Nothing actually lines up. So one of the things that was very clever the combination of the skills of Vita and Harold was Harold did all the design work, all the layout, and Vita did all the planting plans. And one of the clever things that Harold did was to disguise the fact that it's all a strange shape. He made it look square, disguised the fact that this garden slopes away. Delos. And this came about because Vita and Harold did a lot of travelling around, and in the mid-1930s they had a holiday in the Aegean Islands, and there was an island called Delos, which is a religious island full of temples and so forth. And she was so struck with this dry garden concept that when she came back she wanted to have a dry garden. So she did that, she made a dry garden. Unfortunately, her garden didn't last very long because it was all of these dry loving plants planted into deep wet Kentish clay, so it didn't last. Lasted about 4 or 5 years, and then it reverted to being a typical English woodland garden, which was very, very nice, but not the dry garden. About 10 years ago, the National Trust decided it wanted to recreate Vita's dry garden. So it got the garden designer Dan Pearson and our head gardener Troy Scott Smith. They got together and came up with a reimagining of Vita's dry garden. It started about 5-6 years ago, the work, and finished about 3-4 years ago.
The history of the house and estate is interesting because it had a very big, sprawling house, and then it didn't. There was a house on this property back in the 1300s, possibly earlier. In 1490, it was sold to the Bakers. They built this really big red brick building and the tower between 1530 and then 1560. This area is where there would have been a moat and also one of the wings of the house. The Bakers lost a lot of money in the Civil War and they couldn't keep the house. It was leased to the government and used as a prison for French soldiers who basically trashed the place. By the 1850s, under new ownership, much of the house was demolished and the estate became basically a farm and farmhouse. have to be very careful here because there's a lot of uneven path and steps, and I may trip suddenly. And the camera will go flying if I don't watch. Although that would be interesting footage. We got to climb up the tower. Inside was Vita's writing room, where she spent many hours and allowed no one except the dogs. Maybe we're the dogs? So this is the top of the tower, looking on the grounds. And I'm a bit out of breath. So these are the oast houses, and those little things on the top are for ventilation. They dry the hops when they used to grow hops in this area. So I'm inside the oast house, and this is the inside. This is where they put the hops.